It's time to re-review Intel's Arc B580, and boy do I have a lot of data for you, so much so that we're going to need to get into this one right away or we're just never going to get it done. And I'm just going to assume that you are aware of the recent exploration into the B580's overhead issue that sees performance suffer in CPU-limited gaming scenarios, and it's particularly noticeable with slower CPUs. But if you haven't seen all that stuff, I highly recommend you go back and watch those videos first, and the links will be in the description. After realizing that the B580 doesn't look quite as stellar as it does with the 9800X3D when using a slower CPU, such as the Ryzen 5 5600, it became obvious that a re-review was in order. So therefore I'm going to add some 5600 results to my original B580 review data, and I won't be doing this with just the B580, but I'll also be adding in the RTX 4060, RX 7600 and RX 7600 XT. They'll all be added to the retesting using the 5600, and that'll allow us to compare the data with what we've previously seen using the 9800X3D. On top of all of that, I've spent quite a few days collecting a new set of results using the same 12 games, but this time with lower quality presets, mostly medium, as well as some 1440p quality upscaling data, which is extremely interesting, and we'll get to that after the initial re-review data. So, as I said, there is a lot to go over, so let's get into it. Now, the good news is, as I explained in my previous two videos covering the Arc overhead issue, that this problem is only likely to occur in very CPU-demanding games, and thankfully, that is indeed the case. So I'm going to quickly go over a lot of the examples where the performance and/or scaling goes unchanged when using the Ryzen 5 5600, and here are those examples. Testing with a Plague Tale Requiem shows that at 1080p, we're only looking at a very minor performance decline for the B580, 3% for the average frame rate and 8% for the 1% lows. So the hit to the 1% lows is slightly concerning, given that the RX 7600 and RTX 4060 saw no such decline, but they were also slower to begin with, so not really a big deal there. Then at 1440p, the B580 still remains much faster than the GeForce and Radeon competition, and saw no hit to performance with the 5600, so that's a great result. Then we have titles like Dragon Age, where there's no performance hit at all. The B580 delivered the same performance using either the Ryzen 5 5600 or Ryzen 7 9800X3D, and this was the case at both 1080p and 1440p. Dying Light 2 is another example where performance only declines ever so slightly. We're talking about a 4% drop-off for the average frame rate when pairing the B580 with the 5600, and a slightly larger 8% hit to the 1% lows. So not massive, but also less than ideal given that the Radeon and GeForce GPUs saw no performance hit. Star Wars Jedi Survivor saw no performance change when running the B580 and 5600 opposed to the 9800X3D. It's possible that this won't be the case in all areas of the game, but it is the case in the section that we use for our GPU testing. Now, the performance in The Last of Us Part 1 is concerning, because previously, using the 9800X3D, we were looking at 75 FPS on average at 1080p using the B580. But with the slower 5600, the result has dropped down to just 53 FPS. That's a 29% reduction. Now, although the 5600 is a slower CPU, and therefore can reduce frame rate performance, the concerning part here being that the RTX 4060 only saw a 6% decline, and the RX 7600 just a 5% performance loss. So just single-digit losses for the GeForce and Radeon GPUs. This does, however, appear to correct itself at 1440p, and this is because the frame rates here are so much lower when using the ultra quality preset, so much so that the CPU bottleneck is just less of an issue. But we're also at less than 60 FPS. So what happens if you were to enable upscaling? Well, this is an interesting thought, and it is something that we're going to explore shortly, so keep that in mind. Now, the Starfield performance was already pretty poor to begin with. Arc has some very serious frame pacing issues in this title, so the fact that performance was reduced by 10% is bad, but the performance was already bad, again, to begin with, as I said, so not too much is lost here. Now, the War Thunder data using the default DirectX 11 mode is very eye-opening. Using the 9800X3D, the B580 was good for an impressive 255 FPS. But when we switch to the Ryzen 5 5600, the frame rate drops to just 155 FPS, a massive 39% decrease. But what's puzzling in this example is the fact that the Radeon GPUs, the 7600 for example, also saw a 36% performance decline when using the slower CPU, despite the fact that the RTX 4060 only saw a 5% reduction to the average frame rate, though the 1% lows were hit by 20%. Now, in the past, we've found that Radeon GPUs can have an overhead issue with older APIs, like DirectX 11 and DirectX 10 for example, whereas the opposite is true with GeForce GPUs. They tend to work well with the older APIs, but often have an overhead issue with DirectX 12 titles. At least the previous generation architectures, that was certainly true. Even at 1440p, we're seeing a decline for the B580 and Radeon GPUs when paired with the 5600, but not so much for the RTX 4060. So these are some interesting results, and we'll explore the War Thunder testing in more detail shortly. Now, a CPU-demanding game where the B580 struggled when paired with the 5600 was Cyberpunk. Here, the average frame rate dropped by 18% with a 24% hit to the 1% lows, and the 1% lows were already looking a bit low on the 9800X3D. Meanwhile, we saw no performance hit for either the Radeon or GeForce GPUs. Now, if we increase the resolution to 1440p, the problem seems to go away, but this is because we're down around 60 FPS. So if you were to enable upscaling, it'd likely come back, and again, we'll explore this soon. The B580 also struggles in Hogwarts Legacy when using the 5600, and 1% lows are hit the hardest here, dropping by 38%. That said, we did also see an 18% hit to the 1% lows of the RTX 4060, so the 5600 does struggle a bit in this title. Again, jumping up to 1440p appears to solve the B580's woes in this title, but really it is just masking them with a lower frame rate, which reduces CPU load. Star Wars Outlaws is another bad example, and in this case, the B580 drops from just 40 FPS with the 9800X3D to 34 FPS with the 5600, and that's a 15% decline. Meanwhile, we see no performance hit for either the RX 7600 or RTX 4060. Space Marine 2 is another bad example for the B580. Using the 9800X3D, it was good for 62 FPS on average at 1080p, but switching out to the 5600 dropped performance by 15%. And then like War Thunder, this is another example where the RTX 4060 saw no performance loss, but the Radeon GPUs did. The RX 7600, for example, was 17% slower when using the Ryzen 5 5600, so a very unexpected result there, and it's much the same at 1440p. Finally, we have Spider-Man Remastered, and as we saw in the previous videos, this one is very problematic for the Arc GPU. Performance at 1080p dropped by 50% for the B580, which is pretty insane. Meanwhile, the RTX 4060 only saw a 13% reduction, and the RX 7600 just 5%. And we see that these issues persist for the B580 even at 1440p. Okay, so here's the 12-game average data, and this looks really bad for the B580, as we're looking at an 18% performance reduction on average when paired with the slower CPU. This is really bad because the RTX 4060 only saw a 4% drop and the RX 7600 a 6% drop. Essentially, the B580 went from being faster than both the RTX 4060 and RX 7600 when paired with the 9800X3D to noticeably slower than both of those GPUs with the 5600. Now, the hit at 1440p is much lower, as we're dealing with much lower frame rates, just a 9% drop here, though that's still much more than the 4% hit the RX 7600 saw, and then the 0% hit the RTX 4060 saw. This means, whereas previously using the 9800X3D, the B580 was 14% faster than the 4060, it's now just 4% faster when both GPUs are paired with the Ryzen 5 5600, and that's going to hurt the value of the Arc GPU. In fact, if we look at this updated cost per frame graph, we see that the B580 is now 17% better value than the 7600, whereas previously it was 21% better value. Certainly not a massive shift there, but we are looking at the much more favourable 1440p data, which does largely mask the overhead issue with lower frame rates. So that being the case, let's move on to what might be more interesting and certainly more real-world data. What we're about to look at here really could be its own video, and the testing involved certainly would justify that, but I wanted to try and make the most comprehensive re-review I could, so I guess strap in. For this data, I am testing the B580, RTX 4060, and RX 7600 using the 9800X 3D and Ryzen 5 5600, both at 1080p and 1440p, along with some 1440p upscaling data, and all of this will be covering the 12 games that we just looked at. So let's get into it. First up, we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor using the medium quality preset. And with the 9800X 3D, we see that the B580 is good for 97 FPS on average, though that does drop to 89 FPS with the 5600. Still, this looks to be a fairly typical CPU bottleneck, and as we've seen previously, this title doesn't appear to be an issue for the B580, at least where I'm testing. Even so, jumping up to 1440p, we learn a few interesting things. At the native 1440p resolution, the B580 is faster than the RX 7600 and RTX 4060, using either of the CPUs that we're testing with here. But if we enable the quality upscaling mode at 1440p, we're actually seeing higher FPS than at native 1080p, and as a result, the Radeon and GeForce GPUs are able to match the B580 at around 90 FPS using the Ryzen 5 5600. Now, using the medium preset, we find some interesting results in A Plague Tale Requiem. When paired with the 9800X 3D, the B580 looks pretty great, beating the RTX 4060 by an impressive 16% margin at 1080p. But using the 5600, it ends up 2% slower when comparing the average frame rate and 11% slower for the 1% lows. And then once we jump up to 1440p, things do change a bit, and for a few reasons. Firstly, the RTX 4060 and RX 7600 can no longer achieve 60 FPS, so they do fall off a bit. And now the B580 has also fallen below the CPU limits, the CPU cap on the 5600 at 71 FPS. But that still made it 27% faster than the RTX 4060, so a big win there for Intel. However, if we enable the resolution optimizer feature, as this title doesn't support FSR or XeSS, the frame rate using the 9800X 3D is dramatically boosted for the B580, hitting 113 FPS, making it 66% faster than the RTX 4060. But if we switch to the Ryzen 5 5600, we find an 80 FPS cap, and now the B580 is 18% faster than the RTX 4060, which is still a very impressive result, but not nearly as impressive as what we were initially led to believe with the 9800X 3D. Now, testing with Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty using the medium preset does dramatically reduce CPU load, as the crowd density has dropped from high to low. So this really helps the B580, and now it looks pretty good at 1080p, even when using the Ryzen 5 5600. The same is also true at 1440p. In fact, the B580 looks even better here, though enabling quality upscaling does reduce the margin. But what if we manually adjust the crowd density back up to high while keeping all of the other settings as they would normally be when using the medium preset? Well, doing so changes things for the B580, and this is most evident when using the Ryzen 5 5600. Previously, it was good for 99 FPS with the Ryzen 5 processor, but now we see just 82 FPS, while performance goes virtually unchanged for the Radeon and GeForce GPUs. This additional CPU load is also evident at 1440p, whereas the B580 was 17% faster than the RTX 4060 when paired with the 9800X 3D, it's now just 5% faster with the 5600. But if we enable quality upscaling, it's now slower than the RTX 4060, and the 1% lows really do take a hit, dropping by almost 20%. Now, previously, we didn't see any issues for the B580 when playing Dying Light 2 Stay Human with the high preset, and this appears to also be the case when downgrading to medium. The B580 is much faster than both the RTX 4060 and RX 7600, even when paired with the Ryzen 5 5600. This is also the case at 1440p, even with upscaling enabled. Dragon Age the Veilguard sees the B580 lag behind a little bit at 1080p, and it's not due to CPU performance, as the 9800X 3D and 5600 yield the same results. Then at 1440p, the B580 sees a lesser performance hit, allowing it to match the RTX 4060, though it does fall a little behind with upscaling enabled, but overall, this data looks pretty typical and reasonable for the B580. Now, as seen in the previous testing, Spider-Man Remastered was a real sore point for the B580, and this time we've downgraded from the very high preset to high, Using the 9800X 3D, the B580 rendered an impressive 160 FPS, making it 13% faster than the RTX 4060, though the 1% lows were similar. It was also 42% faster than the RX 7600, so an easy win here for Intel. But when we switch to the Ryzen 5 5600, the B580 drops down to 82 FPS. Still very playable performance, but in terms of value, it's quite poor now, coming in 26% slower than the RTX 4060 and 20% slower than the RX 7600. So that's pretty bad. Now, we're moving to 1440p, we see a similar thing at the native resolution. The B580 crushes the competition when paired with the 9800X 3D, but when we drop down to the Ryzen 5 5600, it's only able to roughly match the RX 7600, making it 16% slower than the RTX 4060. But if we enable upscaling, the situation with the 5600 gets even worse. Now the B580 is 27% slower than the RTX 4060 and 21% slower than the RX 7600. So again, despite delivering very playable performance overall, it's still a very bad result as it kills the value of the B580. The Hogwarts Legacy data is also very interesting. Previously, using the high preset, the B580 was able to match the performance of the RTX 4060 at 1080p when using the 9800X 3D. However, here we see when extending the FPS headroom with a lower quality preset, even with the 9800X 3D, the B580 is slower than the RTX 4060, which limits performance to 106 FPS. And while that may certainly be pretty great performance overall, when assessing the value, this sort of result just isn't very good for the Arc GPU. Now, at native 1440p using either CPU, the B580 is able to match the RX 7600, making it slightly faster than the RTX 4060, but once we enable upscaling, it's all over for the B580, losing using either the 9800X 3D or 5600, as the overhead issue costs it very badly here. Previously, we saw when using the ultra quality preset that the B580 really struggled in Space Marine 2, and when dialing down to medium, this really barely helps with performance, only boosting the average frame rate by 6% to 66 FPS when using the 9800X 3D and then 8% with the 5600. The problem is, using either CPU, the Radeon and GeForce GPUs are much faster. Oddly, performance at 1440p doesn't really change with the medium preset when compared to what we saw with Ultra, and the B580 also looks particularly bad when paired with the 5600. Using upscaling at 1440p, it is 25% slower than the RTX 4060. And in this example, we also see a bit of an overhead issue with the RX 7600, as performance dropped by 10% with the 5600 when compared to what we saw with the 9800X 3D, whereas the RTX 4060 saw no change at all. Dialing The Last of Us Part 1 down to the medium preset shows very strong performance from the B580 when paired with the 9800X 3D, 120 FPS on average. Then with the 5600, performance still looks mostly good, and I say mostly good because we are seeing the 1% lows slip a little bit here. Now this data is once again extremely interesting. At native 1440p, the B580 crushed the RTX 4060 and RX 7600. Both could only render around 60 FPS, while the B580 was rendering over 80 FPS. However, if we enable upscaling, the B580 gains virtually nothing, and this is because the overhead is limiting CPU performance, and this even seems to be an issue with the 9800X 3D. As a result, the 7600 and 4060 are able to catch up, delivering similar performance when using the Ryzen 5 5600. The Star Wars Outlaws results look pretty typical really, though the B580 does look strong here, even with the Ryzen 5 5600. So let's take a look at the 1440p data. So at native 1440p, the B580 is able to beat both the RTX 4060 and RX 7600, but if we enable upscaling, the RTX 4060 does jump ahead of the Arc GPU. This is because whereas the B580 saw a 36% uplift when enabling upscaling, the 4060 saw a massive 59% boost, though the Radeon GPU saw a more mild 34% increase. Then we have Starfield, where the B580 isn't that good, and even with the medium preset, we're still looking at lower 1% low performance than you'd expect given the average frame rate, which is similar to that of the RX 7600. Then at 1440p, we do see similar results again. The B580 is more comparable to the RX 7600 with just weaker 1% lows. Okay, so last up we have War Thunder, which I tested using both the DirectX 11 and DirectX 12 modes, and again, some very interesting results here. Firstly, looking at the DirectX 11 data at 1080p, we see some significant differences between the 9800X3D and 5600 CPU results. Firstly, with the 9800X3D, the B580 is faster than both the 4060 and 7600, at least when looking at the average frame rate, but it is only able to match the 1% lows of the Radeon GPU. But when we switch to the Ryzen 5 5600, a number of changes occur. Firstly, the RTX 4060 saw a 25% performance hit, which makes sense, the 5600 is a much slower CPU, but the 4060's 25% hit is an interesting reference point here because the RX 7600 saw a 41% performance hit, so a far more significant performance decrease there for the Radeon GPU. But the B580 saw an even bigger FPS decline, dropping by 52% to 184 FPS. So obviously, still very playable performance overall, but relative to its competitors, it's not great. Then switching to 1440p, the data gets even crazier. At native 1440p using the 9800X3D, the B580 is now crushing the RTX 4060, which appears to have some sort of bandwidth issue here. And as a result, the B580 is almost 50% faster and a little over 20% faster than the RX 7600. But when we switch to the Ryzen 5 5600, this all changes, and now the RTX 4060 is by far the fastest GPU here, and even the RX 7600 is faster than the B580, quite a bit faster when comparing the 1% lows. And the margins worsen for the B580 when we enable upscaling, as this does nothing for the Intel GPU, while the RTX 4060 saw an 18% uplift and the RX 7600 a 7% uplift. But what if we try the DirectX 12 mode, which the developer lists as a beta option, or beta if you're from the US? Switching to DirectX 12 changes everything. The RTX 4060 is now much more competitive at 1080p when paired with the 9800X3D, while all three GPUs performed much better with the Ryzen 5 5600 when compared to what we saw with DX11. Increasing the resolution to 1440p sees the B580 and RTX 4060 neck and neck using either the 9800X3D or 5600, though the RTX 4060 does have more headroom with the 9800X3D, which makes sense, it was the fastest at 1080p. But in this example, it's interesting to note that using a low-level API really helps the B580's overhead issue, which it should, but we haven't always seen that. Okay, so here's a look at the average performance seen across the 12 games tested at 1080p. Using the 9800X3D, the B580 was 2% faster than the RTX 4060 and 10% faster than the RX 7600, so decent performance, but certainly not big gains. Then with the slower Ryzen 5 5600, things look pretty dicey, and now the B580 is 8% slower than the RTX 4060 and roughly able to match the RX 7600 with weaker 1% lows. Then at 1440p, we have some mixed data. Starting with the native results, we see that the B580 really overpowers the 4060 and 7600 when paired with the 9800X3D, while that's not so much the case with the 5600, though you'd expect to see more CPU-limited data with a slower CPU. So for the most part, that makes sense. But as we shift to the 1440p upscaling data, there are a few troubling signs. Using the 9800X3D, the B580 still looks good, just edging out the RTX 4060, but when switching to the Ryzen 5 5600, it starts to go a bit wrong. The B580 is now only able to match the RX 7600, making it 9% slower than the RTX 4060. So if I were to calculate the cost per frame based on this 1440p upscaling data with the Ryzen 5 5600, the B580 ends up being a mere 9% better value than both the RTX 4060 and RX 7600, or just 5% better value than the 7600 if you can get the Radeon GPU for $250 US, which is possible right now. So all of this new data changes quite a few things, but let's start by talking about how these updated results using the Ryzen 5 5600 compared to what we saw in our day one review with the Ryzen 7 9800X3D. Based on the original review data, the B580 was 21% better value than the RX 7600 at 1440p and 27% better value than the 4060. And this was of course using the 9800X3D. Then with the Ryzen 5 5600, the margins have changed a little. The B580 is now 17% better value than the Radeon GPU and 20% better than the GeForce GPU, so still respectable margins there for Intel. However, it's worth keeping in mind this data is more of a best case scenario for the Arc GPU, especially when pairing it with a slower CPU. This is because the ultra quality settings often saw frame rates at or below 60 FPS. So if you're willing to tune the quality settings and enable upscaling, then the value will continue to fall away, as we just saw. For example, based on what I believe to be the more real-world 1440p upscaling data, the B580 really struggles, offering less than 10% better value over the GeForce and Radeon competition, which just isn't nearly enough. I think given the trade-offs you'll find with the Arc GPU, it really needs to be at minimum 20% better value, at least in my opinion. I've also prepared a 50-game benchmark head-to-head between the B580 and RTX 4060, which you were meant to be seeing in place of this video, but I've had to go back and rework that content in light of this overhead issue. So you'll see that probably next week. But what I did find in that testing, even with the 9800X3D, was that across a much wider range of games, so 50 games, the B580, it didn't stack up nearly as well against the RTX 4060 as it does in the 12-game sample used in the day one review and shown in this video. For example, the review data using the 9800X3D at 1440p found that the B580 was on average 14% faster than the RTX 4060, which is impressive. But when expanding that testing to 50 games, the margin came down to just 5%, and even if I removed the outliers, it was still a 7% margin. So half that of the day one review. This means if you were to compare the B580 and RTX 4060 across 50 games using a CPU like the Ryzen 5 5600, the B580 is likely going to come out slower, much like what we saw in our upscaling data. So what does all of this mean for Intel's Arc B580? Firstly, for most of you, in fact almost all of you, the value of the B580 isn't quite as good as what we first thought. There are now additional purchasing qualifiers. For example, you really need a relatively new, reasonably powerful CPU to really take advantage of the Arc B580. And if you have anything slower than a Ryzen 5 5600, you absolutely should buy a Radeon or GeForce GPU instead. That said, as it often does, it'll come down to the games you play, and even then, how you play them. But as a rule of thumb, the overhead issue means that the B580 is going to be a poor choice for those of you with older or weaker CPUs. So not exactly a great qualifier for a budget entry-level GPU. There's also the issue that for those of you who aren't playing CPU demanding games right now, but could very well be doing so in the future games are likely to become more demanding and use more of your CPU. And if that's the case, the B580 will require you to upgrade your CPU sooner rather than later. So if you had a Radeon or GeForce GPU, you would probably get away with putting that upgrade off a bit longer. For me to be still as excited about the Arc B580 as I was a few weeks ago, you really need to be pairing it with at least a Ryzen 5 7600 or Core i5 13600K, and then of course anything better is a bonus. But pairing the B580 with slower CPUs, it does really start to hurt the value, and it really kills it depending on the games you're playing. Now, Intel is aware of our findings and are investigating the issue, but beyond that, I have no official information for you. It's possible they'll be able to address this issue with a future driver update, but as I said in my initial assessment, I'm not overly optimistic that that'll be the case and that they'll be able to solve this one anytime soon, though that is based on nothing more than a gut feeling and a crude understanding of just how insanely complex this issue is. One thing's for sure though, if you can't pick up a B580 for the $250 US MSRP, or anything less than that, I think you're best off just getting a Radeon RX 7600 or perhaps check out your second-hand market for a deal there. Maybe you can snap up a cheap 6700 XT, something along those lines. Anyway, that is going to do it for this re-review of Intel's Arc B580. I think we know pretty much everything we need to know now about how it behaves with different CPUs. I know there are Intel CPUs that could be tested as well. Core i5 12400F would be one that I'd be interested in looking at. and perhaps that's some content we can do in the near future. But obviously we have a lot of new GPUs and stuff coming up, so really the takeaway here is if you have a slower CPU, the value of the B580 is probably not going to be as good as first thought. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you'd like to support all the work we do at Hammer Unboxed and get some cool perks in return, then we have the join button or Patreon. Links are in the video description for Patreon. Signing up to that, you'll get access to our exclusive Discord server where I share benchmarks and testing. We talk about all kinds of things. We do a monthly live stream. There's behind the scenes content, Q&A stuff there. So check that out if you're interested. But if not, that is perfectly fine. And of course, I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.